This is CNN Breaking News.
ISIS, formerly known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, has gained quite a bit of attention in recent weeks. Many have opinions on why all the chaos started, and in many cases the people are wrong. One of the single most important factors in the resurgence of ISIS is the Iraqi Shias and the Iraqi Sunnis. ISIS are Sunnis, and the tension between the two groups is a powerful recruiting tool for ISIS. The difference between the two largest Muslim groups began with an argument over who took the throne after the Prophet Muhammad's death. But Iraq's sectarian problems aren't about 7th century disputes. They're about today's power. Most Iraqis are Shias, but Sunnis had taken over when Saddam Hussein, himself Sunni, ruled Iraq. Saddam spread a false belief that is still followed today, that Sunnis are the real majority in Iraq. This makes the Sunnis feel as if they deserve more political power than is allotted by their size. Today the two groups don't trust each other, and haven't progressed while trying to gain control of Iraqi political institutions. For example, Shia used control over the police force to arbitrarily detain Sunni protesters demanding more representation in government last year. So long as Shias control the government, and Sunnis don't feel like they're fairly represented, ISIS has an audience for its radical Sunni message. That's why ISIS is strong in the heavily Sunni northwest. Now to Ezra Klein for a brief history of ISIS and the current crisis in Iraq.
The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant has taken over about a third of Iraq. They're called ISIS for short, but it's easier to understand what they are if you know them by their old name, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They were a key part of the insurgency after America's 2003 invasion toppled Saddam Hussein. And at the time, they had a lot of support from the country's minority Sunnis. They held a lot of territory because Sunnis were furious both with the Americans, who had kicked Saddam Hussein out of power, and the Shias, who had taken over the government. But Al-Qaeda in Iraq had big ambitions. They didn't just want to kick America out. They wanted to set up an Islamic State. So they banned music, and they banned smoking. Women couldn't show their hair. And they began beheading civilians who disobeyed their rules. Starting in 2006, their brutality lost them the support of Iraqi Sunnis, who partnered with U.S. forces to help push Al-Qaeda in Iraq out of the country. America takes a lot of credit for this. We call it the surge. We're very proud of it, and we should be. But the big thing we did in the surge was we helped the Sunnis, the Sons of Iraq, as they call themselves, rise up against Al-Qaeda in Iraq's savage theocratic rule. So Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated, but they weren't destroyed. They were driven out of much of the territory they used to control, and then they began rebuilding. In particular, they became heavily involved in the fighting in Syria. They were trying to overthrow the Shiite Assad regime. Their tactics in Syria were so brutal, and their ambitions were so grand, that Al-Qaeda itself actually cut ties with them. Al-Qaeda thought Al-Qaeda in Iraq was bad for the Al-Qaeda brand. After their split with Al-Qaeda in February 2014, they renamed themselves ISIS, and they began setting up extortion rackets from Syria. They took over part of the oil industry. They sold electricity back to the Syrian government that they were fighting. Meanwhile, in Iraq, Prime Minister Maliki had been ruling on sectarian lines. Maliki is a Shiite, and he was empowering Shias. He was violently breaking up Sunni protests. He was arresting Sunni politicians. So the minority Sunni population began to hate him and fear him. So ISIS returned to Iraq, and they began selling themselves as the Sunni champion against Maliki. And they gradually grew strong enough to challenge the Iraqi government in the country's second largest city, Mosul. So when 800 ISIS soldiers challenged 30,000 Iraqi army troops in the mostly Sunni city, the Iraqi troops, most of them, they put down their arms and they ran. This was a group that was largely Sunni. They simply refused to fight and die for a Shiite government that they didn't think cared for them. That ultimately is where ISIS's real power comes from. They get weapons and they get money from the territory they control, and they have skilled fighters, but they're facing a government that's widely unpopular among Sunnis. Only a tiny percentage of Sunnis actively support ISIS's goals, but at least for now they appear willing to let ISIS operate in their territory freely because they see it as an alternative to a Shiite government they despise. But ISIS wants to do much more than that. They want to set up a new state that reaches into both Iraq and Syria, one that governs according to a medieval interpretation of Islam. And so Iraq's Sunni population is caught between two terrible forces: a Shia majority that violently represses them to hold on to political power, and a theocratic militia that will kill them if they step too far into the
And some things we should know. One, being that ISIS wants failure of the Iraqi government and wants to establish a caliphate in Iraq. They also see oil as an important part of its future development and funds itself through it, as of now at least. Obama has greenlit air support for Kurdish forces throughout Iraq. With this expanded support, Kurdish troops may be in a position to launch a water campaign against ISIS. The northern Iraqi city Mosul was captured by ISIS and is considered a huge breakthrough. We know that the Iraqi army outnumbers ISIS, estimated 30,000 for ISIS and the Iraqi army to be 250,000. But ISIS captured Mosul with 40 to 1 odds, which really makes you think, is it possible for them to capture more? And now to Tara Long with more information on the Sunni and Shiite Muslims.
The terms Sunnis and Shiites get thrown around a lot when discussing Middle Eastern conflicts. Sometimes it's useful, but most of the time it feels like it's just shorthand for these people hate each other. But with over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, there's no way they can all be involved in some Hatfields and McCoy-style blood feud. So what's really going on here? Well, first of all, not all Sunnis and Shiites are at war with each other. There are tons of places where they coexist peacefully, like the United Arab Emirates, or Dearborn, Michigan, for example. It's also worth noting that their religions aren't diametrically opposed. In fact, the Sunni-Shiite conflict isn't even really about religion, it's about power. Originally, Muslims were all one group, unified under the Prophet Muhammad. Then, in the year 632, Muhammad died, and Muslims split off into two separate groups. The Sunnis wanted Muhammad's successor to be chosen by his community of followers, while the Shiites wanted the leadership to stay within the Prophet's family. The Sunnis were in the majority, so they chose their new leader to be the Caliph, which is basically the head of state. The Shiites did not recognize this new leader, and instead, they chose Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, as their new imam, which also basically means head of state. That was the main source of divide, and from there, things really only got worse. Early on, most of the Shiite imams met violent ends at the hands of the stronger Sunni caliphs, including Imam Ali's son, Hussein, whose beheading is still considered a major holiday for Shiite Muslims. Today, there are numerous Sunni and Shiite militant groups, terrorist organizations, and oppressive governments. Being Sunni or Shiite doesn't necessarily make you a member or even a supporter of those groups, but they're still divided up that way. In fact, every nation with Sunni-Shiite conflicts has large militant groups on both sides, and they all have a history of oppressing one another depending on who's currently in power. Iraq, for example, was run by an oppressive Shiite regime before Saddam, then an oppressive Sunni regime under Saddam, followed by an oppressive Shiite regime once again after Saddam left power. Now the oppressive Sunni militant group ISIS is threatening to take over huge parts of the country. So you can see that the Sunni-Shiite conflicts are more about power, politics, and retribution than actual religion. And truthfully, the words Sunni and Shiite aren't even the best words to use when discussing Sunni-Shiite conflicts. They are way too general. If you're talking about militant jihadists or terrorist networks, but what you really mean is ISIS or Al-Qaeda, just say ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Otherwise, you're including billions of people who aren't even involved and most likely don't share the beliefs of those fringe organizations.
On August 19th, a video surfaced as a warning to the U.S. to stop airstrikes against the group in Iraq. ISIS captured and executed the conflict reporter James Foley on camera after being missing in Syria for 2 years. Later, on September 2nd, another video surfaced. It was an execution of a second American journalist, Steven Sotloff. Iranian leadership showed interest in working with America on Iraq's issues, but the Obama administration hasn't taken Tehran on the offer to cooperate. During a call with press before Obama's September 10th speech, an administration official says, "We do not cooperate or coordinate militarily with Iran," end quote. Some debate that the Obama administration is to blame for this chaos, and that Obama did not succeed in extending the Bush era, which stipulated that all U.S. troops had to withdraw from Iraq by the end of 2011. The administration tried and failed to negotiate provisions that would have allowed the United States to leave a number of troops there. Obama now has a 6-point plan in defeating ISIS. 1. Significantly expand the bombing campaign in Iraq. 2. Train and equip the Iraqi army and Kurdish troops. 3. Begin the bombing in Syria. 4. Train and arm the Syrian rebels. 5. Get regional actors like Saudi Arabia and European allies on board to counter ISIS regional and international influence. 6. Keep U.S. troops out and stay away from the Syrian-Iranian governments.
Thank you to Kurz Gazette for a video of Iraq in a nutshell.
And they changed the game in Syria like no one expected. ISIS was so unbelievably violent and radical that soon it was at war with almost every other faction of the Syrian rebel armies. They attacked and killed members of other Muslim terrorist groups. In the territories they controlled, they built an Islamic State with rules so strict that even the hardliners of Al-Qaeda and Saudi Arabia were shocked and withdrew their support. ISIS has been accused of responsibility for multiple massacres against civilians, countless suicide bombings, the hostage-taking of women and children, the execution of their prisoners, and beheadings. All kinds of medieval horrors we would rather not have to illustrate. And this lovely gathering of human beings recently decided it was time to take more territory in Iraq. Since the US left Iraq, the Shia Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has monopolized power and discriminated against Sunnis wherever possible. The government of Iraq is widely regarded as being corrupt, incapable, and it's certainly hated by a large part of its citizens. The Iraqi army, consisting of about 300,000 soldiers, was created using $25 billion in tax money, but it's not loyal to its government and has been withdrawing or completely disbanding, giving up city after city. Because ISIS has announced that everyone who opposes them will be killed, they have proven they mean business. By June 2014, they'd conquered a big chunk of Iraq, including Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. They'd stolen hundreds of millions from captured banks, making them the richest terror organization on earth. And they are constantly working on establishing a super medieval religious state. Iran and the US are even considering working together.
For all of us at CNN, I'm Tyler Stinson, and you stay classy, period, too.
That was easy.